Hello, everyone, and welcome to this WKO5 webinar, Annual Training Concepts. Specifically, this is part two, mid to late base or extensive aerobic development. Um, we have a lot of things to cover today, so I am rolling fast right out of the gate here. Hopefully everybody will catch up. My name is Tim Cusick. I am the Training Peaks WKO product leader. I'm also the master coach or the head coach at Velocious Cycling, Endurance Velocious Cycling Coaching. So one of the things real quick, because I know time has gone by, I think a lot of people associate me with just WKO. I am a coach. I've been coaching out there for 15 plus years. I have had the luxury of working with some amazing athletes. I have 4 world championships and over 30 national championships to my credit, most of those US, but actually a fair amount of international ones. So in reality, I've been doing this for a while. I really kind of hate saying that and even pointing it out, to be honest with you, but I get a lot of questions lately of how do you know this in real coaching? Well, I am a real coach first. Data has been a coaching tool and a supporting science during that time. So I try to blend my coaching experience and knowledge with data to help get you guys through these programs. For today's program, please feel free to ask questions as we go, but use the Q&A button somewhere down here in your little control panel. Do not use the chat button. There's this weird thing with Zoom. I can't watch both easily, so I'm only going to be watching the Q&A button from this point forward. If you chat, I will not get to you. And finally, everything we're going to talk about today is my opinion. One of the things when we designed WKO4 and WKO5 is we wanted to give you a tool to help support your coaching knowledge and wisdom and learning, not tell you how to coach. These webinars are not meant to tell you how to coach. They're simply to give you a system, an opinion, sort of mine, that hopefully could help you build your structure, process, formats. Today we are doing part two of this 3-part series. Part two was late-based training, intensive aerobic training. If you have not seen part one and you're watching this recorded, I would stop this recording, go watch part one because it's important, and then come back and watch part two. For those of you who have seen part one, here we go. I am going to do a little bit of summary of part one of periodization just to establish some background for us today. When we start talking about athletic performance, what does it take? I use this slide frequently and will continue to do so because it does an excellent job of pointing out that it's a combination of muscular, cardiovascular, and neurological factors that all have to work together to produce velocity and power. Excuse me, I want to take a drink. The reality is we need to remember that all of the training we're doing needs to end up being because we want more power. We want to move our bike or ourselves faster down the road or trail or whatever you're on. It's not just training for the sake of training or training to have a higher CTL. It's we want velocity and power. And the way to do that is to combine muscular and cardiovascular and neurological response. And you could even go a little deeper, right? Here's all the physiological determinants of performance. And there's a lot of stuff in there, right? Which means in the end of the day, it's complicated. And as coaches, we're forced to deal with all of that complexity with an end goal of bringing our athlete to some peak performance at the time the athlete wants it. And while we're dealing with all this complication, we're also dealing with something called the butterfly effect. Some small change, right? Something that has gone wrong, or maybe even something that's gone right, creates downstream ripples, right? That really can be impactful on our training effectiveness. So we have to be looking for system and ways to better organize our training. Periodization gives us an excellent format for that. Now, periodization is such a generalized term, right? There's no science that a periodized plan absolutely works better, but there's tons of practical experience that it does because it helps you as the coach and the athlete create a series of organizational or organization principles that help you apply quality training. So let's think about that a little bit. Really, all you're doing when periodize is you're taking a training year or actually some bigger cycles, but I talked about that in session one. But you're taking a training year and you're breaking it into lesser cycles, a macro cycle, which is the year, mesocycle, which is like phases. You're breaking the year down into, which there can be generalized phases and even more specific phases, which we're pretty familiar with a lot of these languages. And we have microcycles, which can really break everything down into really minor, tiny little chunks. And in the reality, this periodization over time allows us in a reasonably organized way to apply both the principle of progression and planned recovery, both of which are encapsulated typically as your general adaptation syndrome or GAS, right? Pretty simple process. Periodization helps us organize scheduling all of that progression and planned rest periods. There are different types of periodization that are out there. Again, I explained all of this a little deeper in part one, but there's things such as linear, sometimes referred to as block, but block progression or block periodization is actually something else. Reverse, undulating, there's others. Watch session one, I give you a couple of examples, or just go out and do the research. But that, as we begin to understand periodization and use it more in our training, we really have to begin to remember that periodization is really only a system of organization. So many times I see people talk about periodization as the plan. It is not the plan. It's actually just like training load, it's a very neutral construct. It's just X's and O's, right? Arrows and progression and boxes or however you do it. The reality is it's not a training process or modality. And you, as the coach, have to define your training process and modality within that to make it work. And that's what part one, part two, and part three are on, right? Again, I went deeper in all of that in part one, but that really is the basis. What I want to spend some time talking to you about in these sessions is understanding, yes, we have a periodized strategy that helps us organize and implement training in a way that you and the athlete can understand and agree on. And it also breaks it down into sizable little chunks, right? Things that you can digest and have milestones and targets and things to achieve. But it is not training itself. It's not a process, nor is it a modality. So when we start thinking about annual training process, here's how I put it together in my fancy PowerPoint image making, I guess, right? I think that there's really, in when I look at it as a process, five key things you're thinking about. You're thinking about a diagnosis, right? And that always starts with the ability of the rider and the demand of the event. Then we move on to manipulation. In coaching and training, right, you are manipulating elements of athletic stimuli or dose or prescription, right, in the attempt to produce a certain result. And we think about what we manipulate in our training, most of it revolves around volume and intensity. Now, there is a neuromuscular manipulation that plays a pretty big role in this. And in hindsight, I'd put it in my chart now after I did the first one. But in reality, I didn't want to change it up here mid-presentation. So I would add a third of neuromuscular manipulation in there. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. And I did talk about it in session one. Next, we have the via, right? How are we manipulating this interaction between volume and intensity? Well, that's where you talk about training modalities, right? Then you manage that through blendings of fitness and freshness. You need to be fit to be able to train and perform, right? But you also can't be too fatigued or you need a certain amount of freshness, all coming down to some peak performance. So let's quickly break these down. I particularly want to focus on manipulate, right? So when we think about manipulate, I think this is something that everybody sort of intuitively knows, all good coaches intuitively know, but I think it's a discussion you should have with your athletes so they really understand why each of these play a role. Volume, right? That's the quantity of work performed, and that determines how you adapt. Intensity is the quality of work performed specifically. So, and I should have made that a capital Q, huh? Volume is the quantity, right? But intensity is the quality, right? Volume determines how much you adapt. So what I mean by how much you adapt, right? If you really want to make a big evolution in your performance, whether it's a race performance, but let's just talk about power because it's easier to track that way. Let's say you're trying to improve your 60-minute power from 250 watts to 300 watts, or maybe even 325 watts or 350, whatever, some significantly large jump. The only thing that's going to get you to that large of a jump, in my opinion, is significant upticks in volume, because that's how much you will adapt. Volume drives how much you will adapt. And if you're going to want to adapt to exercise stimuli at rapid adaptation, or I shouldn't say rapid, big leaps in adaptation, you need bigger leaps in volume. Now, when we start talking about intensity, right, that really gives us the definition of that adaptation. It tells us the specificity, the specific performance adaptations that we're looking for. It defines that adaptation. I'm sorry, sometimes you'll see me look over here, I'm looking at questions and just making sure I'm keeping up. Okay. Via the training modality, and simply in the idea in training, modalities represent different forms of implementing training. Let's keep it simple. Different forms of implementing training, or that manipulation of volume and intensity, right? Really, with the end goal of producing a superior adaptive signal, um, while you're managing the fitness and fitness relationship. So what format are you training in? So next, we manage fitness and freshness. That should have been blue. Sorry, I don't know why that changed color. And really, that's the performance manager technique, meaning, we all know here, and I went over it more deeply in session one, we have CTL or fitness, we have ATL or freshness, and we have TSB or form to be able to manage. I think the performance management chart of the PMC does a very good job of helping coaches make determinations on their fitness and freshness management. And finally, the outcome, right? Pretty simple. We want the person to be able to perform at their max capability when they want to perform. So if you think about it, that's pretty much training. I break it down into those 5 process steps. So let's start taking that a little deeper with a case study. And in that case study, right, let's start out with the basis. Here's our periodization schedule. And here's pretty much what you see in periodization. You have some nice little time-bound construct with little squares, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 4 weeks, 4 weeks, and you have base one, base build. You start getting all these intermediate kind of phases put in there, nice and blocky. Well, for me and the WKO process, and it's kind of funny, I really should call that my process to be fair, but this is how I use WKO, excuse me, as part of my training process. So it's my opinion, but it is a WKO driven process. I have different naming protocols. Why? I don't know. I really don't know how I got there. But the reality is I do believe it helps me mentally focus on what I'm trying to create. And I tend to oversimplify things. That's not, meaning that I'm not thinking them out or I'm not putting science behind it, but I like the simpler thought process, the better. So I see these early phases as foundation, move into a short build, move into a short peak, then go ahead and perform. Now I'll break them down into sub bases, but one of the things for me that's really important within a acceptable range is I try not to be as rigidly time bound as I see a lot of approaches towards periodization. I think it's important that the athlete, and I'll kind of give you a quote on this later. Um, I think as coaches and self-coached athletes, we need to understand that the athlete's adaptation to exercise stimuli is going to have its own rate. And we need a system of periodization that estimates and maybe even predicts that rate, but yet is fluid enough to adapt to it's fluid enough to adapt to its ebb and flow, right? Real life realities. I mean, how many times have you made like that perfect periodization plan, right? You go and you build your perfect ATP schedule and you got all your blocks and colors and everything laid out right. And then 2 weeks later, your athlete gets sick or some big stress life thing happens, right? That impacts schedule. But even deeper, what I'm talking about is, let's say you start training in a specific modality, targeting a specific response. You want the athlete to improve something, and you think it's a 4 weeks block, but the reality is it takes the athlete 6, 7, 8 weeks to start showing response to that satisfies you. It's achievable. You need to be flexible and understand there's flexibility in that. Everything with an asterisk is a flexible period. So even though these meso and macro phases are broken down, or this is actually macro and meso, I should say, are broken down into clean little lines, I see them as fuzzy transitional periods that are really bound by transitional activity, which I'll talk about, which means you need to have a strategy versus a plan. So in that, right, this is my breakdown. I'm sharing 80% of what I do. There are some things that I'll do that are proprietary, I guess, to me, or I'm not ready to share at this stage, but I will share it with you. I went over this in depth in session 1, so you'll need to go back to watch that in depth. Based on some questions I received in session 1, I did add the idea of what I'm looking for in fatigue resistance to this chart. So I will share these slides with you. You guys can have them. Here's why I don't mind sharing. And again, I don't want to go deep into it. The reality is you should have one as a coach, right? And I want to make a really interesting comment here. Interesting to me. I don't know if it'll be interesting to you, right? Because I get this question all the time. On this meeting, we have a couple hundred people, right? Of which half are coaches and half are self-coached athletes, right? One of the things I should tell you, and I'm saying, is you should have, before you ever actually build your plan or one plan or multiple plans, you should have your grid with your important factors in it. And each one of these sessions are showing you how I've built mine. Don't just take mine. I mean, you can, I don't care, but build yours and know what's important to you, right? Now, here's something I want to say to self-coached athletes, right? Yes, I'm asking coaches and self-coach athletes to have one. But in reality, right, the biggest struggle for the self-coached athlete that you're going through is, and you're going to go through when you do this exercise, is you are an N of 1. Your grid will only be based off your individual experience, and it will be more fluid and changing. When people, after the first session, I received about 20 questions about self-coaching. Well, I'm my own coach, and here's what I'm trying to do. Do you think that works or not? And I'm always going to write you back the same answer. It depends. I don't know your history. I really don't know all the things you're doing. And to be honest with you, that's exactly why you should hire a coach. If you really want to achieve that performance, a good coach has developed something like this, not by an N of 1, but by tens or 20s or hundreds of athletes over time. And there is massive power in learning from them. So there's a pitch for coaching, and why I don't answer, to be honest with you, self-coach athletes, because I don't know enough about you. If I was coaching you, you're in my system. If I'm not coaching you, the best answer I can give you is a general answer. Just a little heads up there. All right, let's start digging into all of this. And by the way, this schedule is it's never perfect either, right? It's not like, wow, I'm going to implement all these things perfect. As a matter of fact, if 60 to 70% of these things work on schedule, we're having a pretty good plan, because it's always situational, like COVID last year, right? COVID makes you make changes. Like athlete injuries, like the athlete not adapting, you being wrong, right? And having to change. So understand that this is a guide, not an absolute. All right, let's dig in now. So last time we did early base training. Now we're going to do mid to late base training. I'm sorry. One more little recap on early base training. I know what I wanted to do. Lost my spot there. So early base training happens in this phase. And the idea here is my 5 process steps. When you look at early base training, I did this again in series one, I'm producing larger amounts of volume, lower amounts of intensity, and I am tracking an aggressive volume-based ramp rate. My training modality is high volume, low intensity training. Watch series one. I'm managing fitness and freshness typically in 3 to 5 week cycles in the base because we don't have that much intensity. And I'm not really worried at all about peak performance because actually initial performance usually declines. Why? The athlete gets tired, right? We're back into training consistently, we're growing. Watch part one. Now we start to move towards mid to late base. So now we're focusing in this range. And again, not fine lines, right? So I kind of purposely overlap there, but something happening in this range. So now we're starting all the new material. I just wanted to get the basis off the ground. So in this area, this range, intensive aerobic training really is my driver. So what do I mean about intensive aerobic training? Let's start with some definition, right? So if we go back to this idea of 3 training levels or zones, actually would be a better word for here. We have our zone 1, which is below LT1. We have zone 2, which is between LT1 and LT2, and zone 3, which is LT2 and above. These are a very clear and simple construct of physiological systems, right? Intensive aerobic training happens between LT1 and LT2. And there's sweet spot training, tempo. And in my definitions, which I'll answer in Q&A if you ask, but in the name of time, I'm going to keep rolling. Aerobic endurance, which happens just below LT1, and aerobic power, which happens just over LT1. The only reason I ever really use aerobic power workouts is to prepare for tempo and sweet spot. So I use them judiciously. Most of my early base is in aerobic endurance. Maybe a better way for you to see it, I tried to put all this slide together here, is if you look at the classic WKO levels, the COG and I levels, and that free physiological zone, it's stuff happening in here. Now, don't take my box as absolute, right? Don't take my box as absolute because I can't make it line up quite perfectly, but I think you get the idea. As a matter of fact, that red box should be down a little further, more in the middle, more towards the top of tempo here, but not great alignment. I was never good at cut and paste in school. A fair amount of people are asking about how to define LT1. Please watch session one. That's why it was important to watch session one before jumping on today. Or just Google it. There's plenty of great systems out there for estimating LT1. Now, at the core of my intense aerobic in this time period of mid to late base, I am a big believer in sweet spot training. I think it is the highest bang for the buck training you could be doing in this phase, unless you have some highly specific event that requires you to do something different or some reason to be doing something like you're injured or you've just come back. I mean, there are some factors, but in general, I like sweet spot training. As defined by Dr. Coggin, it's 88 to 93%. I've seen people expand that to 85 to 90 and even more. I like the idea of targeting into 88 to 93, but I do understand that at any given day that can have a little range. Why is it called sweet spot training? Because you have the best gain, right? You for the least perceived effort and the least fatigue, meaning because it's just below threshold, the efforts are not that hard, so they're repeatable, so you can do a fair amount of the work. You're not creating a tremendous amount of lactate and muscular microtrauma, so you recover from them pretty well. The athlete perceived exertion is hard, but not too hard, so they can do this kind of work, which is actually a strength and a weakness we'll talk about. And the reality is the physiological response is pretty high. You're getting most of the benefit of threshold training with all of those other benefits, hence the term sweet spot. In defining intensive aerobic training increases the size of the engine. I'm going to get a little deeper into this in a moment. And it does this in a way that is highly specific. I'm certain to say highly specific. It's specific to increasing that engine size, but it's also has a high TSS and CTL efficiency, meaning it allows you to maximize your time a little bit better. And actually, it does a good job of driving strain from stress. If you go back to the power webinar I did about a month ago, we talked about the difference between stress and strain. And stress is linear and strain kind of starts out linear, but as you fatigue goes up and up and up, right? Sweet spot training really takes advantage of that to maximize or create more strain from a linear stress format. So when I say building a bigger engine, right, we go back to this idea of base training as a whole, just trying to give you a little visual and following up what, in part one to now. You talked about, you go out and you do your baseline testing, which I talked about in part one, really just measuring the size of your race car, right? The chassis, the engine block, and the engine, whatever you want to call it, chassis or engine block and the engine. That's the baseline test. You start out your base training with that. In early base training, where we're doing high volume, lower intensity training with occasional bouts of high intensity, all I'm really trying to do is make the chassis bigger, the engine block. I want to support the bigger engine in the future. But early base training is about making that block bigger, ready for the bigger engine. And then mid to late base endurance training is all about, this is where the time frame where you're really hammering away at, this is a time point you're really hammering away at building that bigger engine. So when you're talking about sweet spot training, I'm going to go back to this question real quick. Joe asked the question, in another webinar, you speak about intensive training at 15 to 20 minutes before PTE, 95 to 100%. Yes, Joe, but you're mixing apples and oranges. You're really talking about training zones and targeting in a different way. When you're talking about sweet spot training or intensive aerobic approach and periodization, I'm not really doing much over aerobic and everything's happening within the zones I'm saying. I understand what you mean. It's in the eye levels that way, so I get the confusion. Here, I'm just talking about the general idea of using a strategy of intensive aerobic training. So I have to work, I guess, on cleaning up the definition in eye levels. So I understand that confusion, but two separate things. Okay, so back to my bigger engine, you get it. That's what we're trying to do in this time frame. Sweet spot, this is the slide by Dr. Andy Coggan. Here's a great little thing to see. This is that area, that intensive aerobic training work that I'm talking about in zone 3 and sweet spot. These are the benefits, more X's, more benefits. You can kind of look through. Again, I'm going to share all this. You can do it. I don't want to end up reading the full chart, but I think you'll get the idea. High bang for the buck, excellent aerobic gains in tempo and sweet spot work. Build a bigger engine. This is making the engine. Then we talk about speed and power, those next phases where we're in that build and peak. That's where we tune the engine. Actually, we tune the whole car, but we're really going to tune the engine in that time period. Right now, we just want to make it as big as possible, as big as possible. So let's start breaking down this idea of making the engine bigger, this idea of aerobic intensity or intensive aerobic training, right? So if you take those same 5 steps and say, hey, Tim, in a visual way, what are we trying to accomplish in mid to late base? What are we doing with our process steps to make it effective? Well, it kind of looks like this, right? And this gets a little messier. It was kind of cleaner, right, in early base, because you're doing some volume, you're riding your bike a lot, you're spending a fair amount of time at or near your LT1, your lactate threshold 1. But as we progress into this mid to late phase, we're really making some pretty big changes in the manipulation of the products and the manipulation of the volume and intensity relationship. And really what's happening is we're reducing volume. We're reducing volume as a percentage focus. We might not reduce overall volume. As a matter of fact, I probably would not reduce overall volume unless you had to. And of that, we are now beginning to increase overall intensity. Now, intensity to me during this period, if you watch part 1, I always maintain a small amount of intensity in based training, every 8 to 14 workouts is typically my range, depending on the athlete's limiters, weaknesses, and goals. So I didn't want to drop out that intensity. I probably could have made it a little smaller. And this yellow intensity is now this aerobic intensity, this efforts between your LT1 and LT2, tempo and sweet spot work, right? And in both of those, as part of the manipulation in this phase, I'm thinking about that fatigue resistance. That was the question I received a lot after session 1. I am actually starting to do it in early base through some progressive workouts, which I'll show you. But here's where I do put in a fair amount of, I'm trying to build that bigger engine, right? Bigger aerobic capability. And I also want you to be more fatigue resistant. I want you to start moving that curve. I'm much more focused on moving the curve to the right. And what I'm doing in this manipulation is progressive addition of time in intensive aerobic training and accumulation of TSS, right? So I want to continue to progress TSS progression. And I want to accumulate or I'm earning more of that TSS in this intensive aerobic training area, the training space between LT1 and LT2. The modality, and I do neuromuscular manipulation. I'll tell you what it is. I'll be shifting if you in early phase, I'm doing more high cadence work, nothing special here. I explain why in part 1, but now I'm moving towards more big gear, more force pedaling, which I'll actually explain in some future slides. I received a good question. Would I classify things such as breathing strength? Yes, that is a neuromuscular manipulation and something you should absolutely be working on in these base periods. But then, John, you went on to ask efficiency. Efficiency, you don't manipulate efficiency, even though I think I understand what you mean. Are you trying to gain efficiency here? Yes and no. And if I have the time at the end of this, ask me that question again and I'll explain it. You're clarifying breathing efficiency. Yeah, I mean, I believe there's all kinds of great breathing and breathing devices out there that might or might not be helpful. You should make your own determination. Only one way to find out, right, is test it with some of your athletes on yourself. And there are ways to improve your breathing efficiency. That type of manipulation is all what I mean by neuromuscular manipulation. So this is the time frame to be putting those things in there. Thanks for the clarity. Via the training modality of this manipulation, it was an early base, high volume, low intensity. Now we move to a more pyramidal format. How I manage that pyramidal format, the fitness and freshness relationship, I reduce the length of my macro cycles. Remember, it was 3 to 5 in early base training, and now it's 2 to 3 weeks in mid to late base training. And 2 to 3 weeks depends on your athletic maturity, historical, training, your current CTL, and sometimes age. At 54 now or however old I am, I can't always hold up to a 3-week cycle as well as I used to. So you're always kind of managing that process. But again, remember, I'm trying to avoid absolutes. It's all a little gray and fuzzy. Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 2.5? Well, that's what we should be learning. And the outcome is of what's going to happen to the athlete's peak performances. We really start getting into mid-range intensity here. The athlete's going to have some higher ATL, right? The ATL ramp rate will pick up. They'll have some higher fatigue, and they might become inconsistent, meaning, man, I went out and killed it in Tuesday's workout. I'm going to feel great for 2 weeks. And then they go out Wednesday, right? And they don't feel good at all. As you start increasing that acute training load, right, on the basis of your foundation, inconsistencies in the athlete's performance can happen. And that's part of the growth process. Linear, improvement isn't nice and linear like this, right? It tends to be a little of this and then an improvement occurs, then a little of this and then another improvement occurs. So just understand that you'll have some inconsistent performance as you move into this mid to late phase. You might be linear, you don't know, but in reality, it tends to have that inconsistency. That's a normal amount of it. That's why it's so important you as a coach are doing a good job managing fitness and freshness, because you want to make sure that inconsistency really isn't bad. You know, inconsistency can disguise bad pretty well. So let's break those elements down, right? Let's start with manipulation. Let's talk about volume and intensity. So let's talk about volume. So if you've watched part one, I was talking about an aggressive ramp rate through volume up in, 7 or more TSS per day on a weekly basis, right? Remember, I said track 7 and 28 days from the same starting day. Here, what I will tend to do is reduce the progressive ramp rate as I add intensity. Two reasons. One, I'm concerned whether the athlete will deal with the uptick in acute fatigue, right? The ATL, which ramp rate is predictive of, absolutely. And then two, um, I'm concerned also about, think about what I'm saying here. When we're doing a high amount of high volume and low intensity training, the adaptive signal is always pretty strong, right? Because you're not that tired. You're not doing this catabolic, anabolic. I mean, you're not beating down your body as much. As we start to move to sweet spot training and higher intensities, whether that's tempo or sweet spot, we are starting to begin to accumulate that type of fatigue and damage, right? So we need to make sure that we lighten the load of progression. We're not being quite as ramp rate progressive as we need to be, because we want to leave the body the ability to send that strong adaptive signal and be able to respond to it. Too much sweet spot, too, like if you're really still really being aggressive as you shift to sweet spot and your ramp rate growth, if the athlete can be, um, and you're just banging away, that takes multiple days of sweet spot, maybe 4 or 5, 6 a week. I actually find that dulls the response because the adaptive signal just isn't strong. It isn't sent as well and it isn't responded to as well. Remember, you have all these systems interacting, but the reality is your immune system is the one that is adapting, and it needs to hear that signal and it needs to have the energy to respond to that signal. So just be careful about ramp rate when you get to this. Now, don't get me wrong, there might be people out there who can manage a slightly more aggressive ramp rate, but only go there if you absolutely know it works and they adapt. The second reason I cap it is for most regular athletes, you've kind of done some ramping early base and now you're out of time. Meaning if you only have 12 hours a week, right? You're only going to get so much TSS out of that week, and you're only going to get so much ramp rate. The romance, right? The allure of sweet spot training is if I just do that more every day and harder every day, I'll get even more TSS and I can cheat my duration limitation. Duration limitation. I can only train 12 hours a week. If I just do more, I can do better because I can cheat that duration limitation. Well, in reality, there's only so much you can work around the limit of your duration limitation, how long you can go. Go back to my point about manipulating volume. If you want to make a significant step up, you're going to have to invest in volume. It just is what it is. And in the absence of being able to invest in volume, you need to control the ramp rate of your CTL as you get into these more intensive or harder training periods, training phases. Now, and that's kind of the terminology I used. I slow down the incline of the ramp rate from aggressive to managed. But if I see an athlete who can go through these phases, they've done it a couple of years, they've been adapting to a higher number, I'll do it. But also, if I see an athlete who doesn't, I might use 1 or 2 as my adaptation. You really have to use the historical data. These are just guidelines. So when we look at this general idea of density and frequency, when we're doing it and driving it just by load in the early phase, kind of have one good long day, hopefully one semi-long day, and then some okay long days, and maybe even a little active recovery. As we move into this idea of early high volume, low intensity, that laid out, here it is just as load, but as we look at intensity, you have a little bit of intensity every day, but it's not that big. But as we begin to shift modality, right, or volume, and I'm going to get to the modality a little more in a moment, but our modality is moving from high volume, low intensity to a pyramidal style approach, we can slowly begin to add days of intensity. Like maybe just Tuesday gets to be a little tempo, or, it depends on your point of transition. Um, and then Saturday gets to be a little tempo. Now, don't take my numbers as meaning anything exact except scale. A lot of times I put these charts out there like, well, how many exact hours does that represent? And how much intensity? It really just meant is visual scale. As we begin to transition from early phase to mid to late, add 1 to 2 days, right? Maybe one day is a little bit harder and the other day is not quite as hard of that intensity. Maybe this is early on 30 minutes or 45 minutes of tempo, and maybe this is 20 to 30 minutes. It's just transition. So understand it's just transitional thoughts, because we're still talking about volume, but you can't totally, as we move into this phase, uncouple intensity. Why? Because in reality, you're still in a phase, you're still in your base training phase, and you want to balance volume and intensity. To me, one of the hardest phases to coach an athlete, particularly when things are going right, it's almost easier to coach an athlete when things are going wrong. I know that sounds totally counterintuitive, but the reality is when it's going wrong, you're fixing things, you're situationally managing, you're looking at stuff, you're hyper attuned to things. When things are going right, what does the athlete always want to do in this phase? They've got about 6 weeks of base under them. They're rolling along. They're starting to generate power. Things are getting easy. They want to go harder, right? They want more. They want more watts. They want to tell you their threshold is 5 to 10 watts higher than it is, right? And you have to, as a coach, through base training, when we start getting into the build and peak, we're going to have a high fatigue cost, in a more chronic kind of way. We don't want to begin to start accumulating that chronic fatigue right now for something that isn't going to help us in that time period, right? We want to manage that balance between volume and intensity, with volume still being the driver of the TSS growth. You have to find that exact balance. I have some of my own thinking and stuff like that, but you have to find a balance. Now, in all of these, in part one and now, I'm going to try to use charts that I will generally just give some thinking of charts that I will that for me, help me track things. One of the charts that I look at frequently in trying to maintain this balance, and a quick caveat, all of the data I show is from a sandbox of data. I don't know who it is particularly. I kind of do sometimes because I can identify them from their data, but and it's meant so that I never expose somebody's data unintentionally, right? So sometimes the data isn't the perfect example. Just a heads up. So don't look at this person and say, hey, that athlete did this. It might actually even be a mix of athletes. So just stay on the concept. This is simply, and I've tried to put the charts, these are all in the chart library, chronic and acute. I might edit them at times, but they're in the chart library. Chronic and acute training impact score load. And all we're seeing is a running chronic and acute aerobic score. So we see this athlete going through base training over the last 90 days. They're doing more aerobic. And then in blue, we see an anaerobic score, chronic and acute. See a big uptick in acute here, right? I add to this chart, I'm always looking at the slope. I want to understand at what rate are they moving up or down in trends. I think trend management, when you think about what predicts changes in athletic performance, remember, power is the greatest predictor. Trend precedes significant improvement. So I'm always want to understand what's happening in trend. And that's true in physiological factors too. So what I don't like about this athlete right off the bat in this training is they are increasing anaerobic efforts more quickly, or anaerobic training impact scores more quickly than aerobic. This athlete's trying to train too hard. I actually went through and figured out why. I'll show you in some of the upcoming slides. Good base chart to just look at impact of the work they're doing. Because if you think about what you're looking at here, you're looking at this over time. It's giving you deep insight of the impact of the volume intensity relationship you're prescribing, and a very powerful, simple tool. Okay, that's volume. I know I did a little of intensity there, but it's volume. So let's talk about training intensity specifically now. The reality is I'm moving from a high volume, low intensity training modality to a pyramidal modality. These charts do a great job of visually, I show a bunch of them in part one, but these charts show a great visual of what that means. I'm not necessarily doing away with zone one, even though it gets a little lower, right? But you really see a significant progression in zone two, and maybe even a little more in zone three. I call this the slow wave, right? We're pushing this wave from here to there, right? The wave is kind of heading towards the shore. Um, there's no real reduction in volume progression. And what I mean by volume progression, we're still doing the same volume. So and we'll continue to increase volume unless the athlete has hit their volume duration cap. Again, go back to this, I only have 12 hours or 10 hours or whatever it is, in which case then you cannot continue to progress volume. If you can convince the athlete during this like 8-weekish kind of period to invest in some volume, they will have pretty good returns. Not 15 minutes a week or half an hour a week, but 1 to 2 hours a week. Even that will start because it'll allow you to progress volume throughout this phase also. So a good phase to get them to invest. And I'm kind of got from that early prep right through high volume, low intensity to pyramidal training, which to me is the absolute right answer for this mid to late base. I want to bring in that intensive aerobic. I do have to think about that definition better because it does overlap with the zone, the eye level. I want to bring in this training time in between LT lactate threshold 1, which is this, and lactate threshold 2. I want to train a fair amount of time in the zone where I begin to accumulate blood lactate and where I'm accumulating too much blood lactate, right? I've gone over threshold. Why, right? Well, I've showed you why, and go back to the sweet spot chart and tempo chart. It actually has excellent benefits for building the engine, but I'll give you one other element. So many actual races, gravel races, road races, you spend a tremendous amount of time in here. And I know, and again, you have to watch part one about my discussion between polarized and pyramidal, and you'll see that I'm evolving. I tend to go high volume, low intensity to pyramidal to polarized. So I'm going to polarized, don't get me wrong, but I think polarized has its limits on improvement time. And that means if you do polarized training more than, I don't know, 6 to 10 weeks, you tend to have already plateaued and be heading down. Polarized is an excellent strategy for peak training, but not necessarily building the engine. And what I think is really great about the people and the person who's brought polarized training, originally it was all polarized all the time, but that kind of just got a little bit hyped in the press. If you look at what we're learning now about polarized training, it's really the training rhythm and more. Again, watch part one. Now it's funny, it's one of the things I was talking to one of my athletes the other day, and I was talking about like sweet spot and tempo, and it's just like the term was, oh, training just gets more harder. It's like, okay, you're right. That's a pretty good way of looking at it. And what begins to happen, and I have it as cycle 2, 3, 4, but remember, my times are a little more fluid by movement. We're creating more mid-range intensity and still maintaining some high-range intensity. But in the reality here too, one of the mistakes I think I see a lot of coaches make, my opinion, particularly with very mature athletes that have been training for years, as you make this evolution, you also need more variety of your training. So we have this conundrum of periodization training and the idea of block training in this definition, meaning I'm focusing on one thing in that block. And then the next thing is the next thing in that block. I'm a firm believer in that from a macro sense, from a chronic sense. Systems will stack on top of each other. And if you stack those physiological systems correctly, train one, then train the next one, then train the next one, you'll get to a higher peak. But as the athlete has training maturity, high efficiency, high adaptation, overall adaptation to the idea of training, you need to vary those blocks a little bit more. You can't be as rigid within your block thinking if you want the athlete to continue to respond year over year. Um, so you either have to add significant amounts of volume or simply changing up within the modality. Remember, modality is a training rhythm. It's how you are applying those. You have to change it up and create some more variation. You can track these in, like here, I'm using monthly time and eye levels. This is 3-zone. I just made this chart in PowerPoint. I actually track them in eye levels. So here's an athlete training, transitionary period, cycle 1, cycle 2. We can see they're increasing volume, but remember that intensity, that anaerobic impact score was increasing fast. Well, here we're seeing a fair amount of time in the threshold zone. I see this as a little bit of a red flag for this athlete. They probably would do a lot better with this green and yellow than they would with all that orange. But that's why you track data. There's the chart name, you can track it. If you like to track these things in different reports, or you're using a polarized system or whatever, it's in there. So go ahead and track away and make your own decisions. One of the things that I think is a good chart, I use it all the time. And half these charts were created by the Facebook group. There's so many smart people and they're smarter than me. So it's great to absolutely steal your stuff. Thank you for contributing. No, I try to always give credit. If you look in the description, hopefully the author is always in there. This is just a histogram overlaid to eye levels by color. Pretty cool layout. You get to understand 10-watt increments of where they're spending time. So that's pretty cool. But I went back to that anaerobic training person who had the high anaerobic impact scores and the what we were seeing here. And here's theirs. So I went through and I looked at them and I just flicked it to indoor training only, and their FTP was almost 20 watts higher in indoor training. So here's a person riding Zwift a lot. So you go back to this indoor training thought. Look how much time they're spending. You can literally see it as this double step, right? And you can see that their threshold this is 270. They're banging away because this line right here would be 280. Their model threshold is 282. They're banging away right under threshold a fair amount of time. That's one of the downsides of Zwift. It's one of the downsides of too much training on Zwift. You get sucked into going faster. There's one other cause of that. I'll talk about it in a moment. I pulled this out of the Facebook group today. Steven and posted this great chart builder. This was from part 1, and he built his own. They're already out there and posting on Facebook. Go grab them. All right, so some key points about mid to late base intensity distribution. Volume supplemented by intensive aerobic intensity. Man, you're right. I need to clean that name up. It's too overlapping with the eye level. But volume supplemented by time between LT1 and LT2, or tempo and sweet spot, might be a better way to say it. That's your key progression. Your secondary driver is time and zone progression, more and more tempo, more and more sweet spot. I'm going to show you an example in a minute. Don't forget, just like early block, consistency of training is the core element of success. Any type of training done inconsistently will have inconsistent response. Still love one long day as the booster. Again, watch part 1. Consider variation modality in the schedule. That's what I was talking about earlier. As you get into these phases, for well-developed athletes in particular, you need a little more variation in these phases. And I still do some high intensity once every 8 to 14 days. So remember, we talked earlier about that general density, general load, general volume. We talked about high volume, low intensity training. You begin to remember the wave starts flowing to the right. We start, early, mid base training. You start adding some days of tempo and sweet spot. And then when you fully arrive in this mid to late base training, definitely by late base training, you're doing up to 3 days a week. I know some people will say you could do more sweet spot. I'd rather have you do more sweet spot. If you're strong enough to do more sweet spot, do more sweet spot 3 days a week. Don't do more sweet spot 6 days a week. Meaning, I'd rather have you do 3 times 20 on one day and 3 times 20 on 2 days and 3 times 20 on 3 days than do 2 times 20, 2 times 20, 2 times 20, 2 times 20. You really want this impulse rhythm for your body to respond to. And don't get me wrong, there's situations where you might want to block those together, but in general feedback, 3 times a week is a pretty good volume to be getting um, this type of mid-range intensity. I actually have a chart on that in part one, which I probably should have carried in here. Um, Good question about this long day have benefits for cycling. A long run will not have the same benefits as a long cycle, a long bike ride. Because a long run, the time is totally different. Part of the benefit of a long time is that you're creating, going out for a long ride. Let's call it 3.5 to 6 hours, right? The longer it's depth of kilojoules, it's depth of work, it's time, it's work over time type of stuff. So in running, it's hard to go out and go that long without destroying yourself, right? You don't have the same benefit of running. But if I was a triathlete and that was my goal and I needed to mix them, you have to mix running in there somewhere, right? I might do my running more on the mid-intensity days where time element could be better suited without too much fatigue. And then, yes, keep my long day on the bike. My opinion. Maybe if you're a sprint try and there's reason and you're getting close to late, again, this is general guidelines. Some sample workouts. I only did this and I made all the workouts like just a weird time because I'm not saying do this workout or here's perfect. I'm just giving you some thinking. So workout example in the high volume, low intensity time frame, simple aerobic endurance work that's progressive. I do with my athletes a lot of progressive training, meaning I want them to build the habit of starting a little easier and finishing a little stronger. This change might be 5 to 10 watts. It's all happening if it says aerobic endurance, it's at or near LT1. I don't try to be too precise, but it's at or near LT1. And we start out a little easier, we go a little harder, and we finish a little harder. Too many athletes do group rides or Zwift group rides. I mean, what happens in any Zwift group ride you do, right? It goes out for the first 8 to 10 minutes, 10% harder than it settles into, right? Bad habit early on. And bad habit, unless you're a Zwift racer, and that's your whole goal. So be more progressive. I might do some aerobic power work just above lactate threshold, but it's only just above, LT1. It's just above LT1 because we're doing cadence manipulation. We're just ramping cadence. So we're putting a little more power because it's what's going to happen when you do cadence. Simple, high volume, low intensity training. Then we begin to evolve. This evolution stage can be done for a fair amount. You want to do a little bit of evolution. You don't want to just go from no tempo to tempo, right? So we're evolving aerobic power into maybe some late tempo. Remember, I talk about I'll start doing fatigue resistance. One of the ways you can improve your fatigue resistance is do intervals late in the workout. Your body is so tuned to doing intervals early, you'd be surprised at the mental, the psychological, and physiological response during this phase where you're not chasing super high numbers, moving your intervals to late. And a transitionary workout I might do is this is 6 minutes of tempo done as intervals with a simple 1-minute rest. And that's not the best and most productive way to do tempo, but reality as to get an athlete prepared for tempo, 1, maybe 2 of these workouts, that's just helps them mentally get prepared. It steps them in. Remember, it's a slow wave to pyramidal. The problem is whenever I suggest the idea of transitional workouts, right? People are like, well, I'll do this workout 8 to 10 times before I'm ready for tempo. No. Always the ABP, always be pushing. You as a coach, that one of your main jobs to do is figure out the fastest progression rate your athlete can manage while still being fresh enough to recover and adapt, right? So you're always pushing. If you're doing the same workout more than 3 times, you're not pushing enough, or you have your threshold, or you're using your eye levels wrong. Um, it's one or the other. It really is. We need to continue to push that progressive principle. And then finally, we get into pyramidal. We're deep into the pyramidal cycle right now. We're in that tempo and sweet spot. I might be doing hours of power at tempo with some surges, some hard start, sweet spot type of stuff where we start out a little over threshold. We flush some lactate into the system. We force a better lactate management process, then do some sweet spot, or just some classic over under approaches. Again, just thinking about general ideas, but once we're in pyramidal, this is happening 3 times a week as my basis, sometimes 2, maybe sometimes a 4th, based on the athlete, but that's the general principle. Now, one of the ideas, and I'm winding down slides, I do see the clock. One of the ideas that I introduced in session 1 was this idea of SDT, not to be mistaken with something else. SDT means self-determined training. One of the things that I give my athletes during each cycle is a self-determined training rule. So here's your rule in this phase. And the rule is, if you feel really good, how are you going to maximize that day? If you have great legs and feeling great, why throw away opportunity to have a great training day because you're so rigidly stuck within the construct? So during this phase, and I've said this in other webinars, I want you to, if you're feeling good, expand the time and zone. If you have a 3 times 15 or 2 times 20 on your schedule, make it 2 times 25 or 3 times 20, right? Don't go harder. Expand the time and the zone, right? Because we don't want the damage. We don't want the fatigue of the intensity, right? But hey, if we can handle more time in that zone, which will create a little more fatigue and damage, don't get me wrong, but when you're doing sweet spot, you're kind of on the ragged edge already. Not fatigue, but the reality is just add some more. So just add some more time. So what's the sweet spots of intensive aerobic, or I'm sorry, what's the pros and cons of intensive aerobic approach? I kept this really simple. I almost deleted this slide, and based on time, I should have. I only have like 3 slides left, so we'll get there quick. The pros are it's efficient stress and strain versus time, high bang for the buck. I just went through that. You have lower fatigue and higher repeatability. Gave some background on that. And if the timing is right, you have a superior response. The engine will definitely get much bigger to sweet spot. If you've timed it right, you've gotten them prepared, they've done enough work to be really ready to be doing sweet spot. They're taking care of resting well and eating and the basics, right? They're going to adapt really well, right? But you have to know, right, when you're ready to go. And that's funny. Don't start, like I see a lot of people starting base training right with sweet spot. I'm just going to do, 3 hours of sweet spot a week right out of the get-go. You might want to build some basis underneath that before. So that car, your foundation, your engine block gets a little bit bigger. Then build the engine. But you also you need to know when to stop doing sweet spot and progress on to the next thing, which we'll talk about. The cons, it's very monotone. It's very monotonal, meaning, meh, all right, I'm used to this, whatever. And it's got a sneaky fatigue. Athletes like doing sweet spot because it's just hard enough to make them feel like they're accomplishing something, but it's not so hard they really suffer, right? So they'll tell you, I'm not as fatigued as you think. They'll give better feedback on it because their mind loves that space of sweet spot. Because man, if I tell my coach I'm more fatigued, he or she is going to make me stop. Or if I tell them I'm really, too fresh, they might make me go harder. So you have to just be careful of feedback from your athletes in this phase. Neuromuscular manipulation, I'm going to go through this really quick. Remember, a watt is how hard you pedal times how fast you pedal. At the core of your neuromuscular manipulation in the sense of cadence, watch part 1, is this idea is that you just need to teach your athlete how to produce power at a range of cadences. Okay, the neuromuscular manipulation idea, like I said, I'm not going too deep into this. You need to review and monitor, but most prescriptions here are metabolic. So when you think about cadence return, like I want to do high cadence work, I want to do low cadence work. I'll use low cadence as an example because at this phase, I start going to low cadence. People will think about wow, in my low cadence work, I'm building strength on the bike. That's not really true. You really can't build strength on the bike in low cadence. I mean, it's probably a little bit true, but if you really are strength building, be in the gym or do some other things, that's not part of this mode, what I'm talking about by neuromuscular manipulation. Now you can build force coordination, how you recruit motor units, how you resist fatigue due to that. All of that can occur. And that's what I mean by just keep your thinking metabolic in nature. And I'll move in this phase to low cadence, high force work, right? But the output is generalized. I'm not like, wow, I want to get you stronger. I want to exactly accomplish this. Yeah, we're really teaching you just to make power at a greater range of cadences. Because if you think about event performance, that's crucial. But yet, what's happening in today's world, particularly this year of COVID, right? We're sitting on a trainer drilling out power at exactly 92.5 RPM per second, and we don't change. We use erg mode, right? We use incline. We're doing flat races. And if you look at how we're narrowing, again, I did this in part one, that cadence control, we need to retrain our brains and our body to make power at a greater range. One of the things I find myself going back, and a chart I use a lot for this with athletes, because I want to see if they're doing it. And I want to make sure I'm being attentive as the coach so I can prescribe more and more neuromuscular manipulations in cadence. I'm particularly talking about cadence here. I use MMP by cadence and cycling. And look, here's an athlete that is doing a great job of neuromuscular manipulation of cadence in base training the last 90 days. They're mixing it up pretty well. You see all these cadences generating different powers. That's what I want, the kind of rainbow action going on here, right? That's what I'm looking for. And I can drill down and know where they're making some of their best powers, but really all I want to see, we have the rainbow going on. If it's one color, if it's monotone, I'm not doing a good enough job, or the athlete's not following my direction of changing up cadences and neuromuscular manipulation. And don't get me wrong, I look at good old fashioned quadrant analysis every day. Old school, I know, but it still is a very effective tool. All right, let's talk about the final segment. When is it time to move on? Right? Remember that statement? I should have repeated this slide here. When it comes to training, right? Don't leave before you should, right? I see people doing 52-week structured training plans a year, 54-week structured training plans a year. That's too much structure, too long, right? You got to know by counting backwards, by understanding the athlete's uptake rate, understanding, yeah, you need some flexibility in there, when to begin structure and moving everything forward. And then through each phase, you need to know when to stay in that phase. Hey, it's not time to leave yet. And when time, you also know when it is time to leave and to move on. For me, some of the things that I'm looking at, I look at more, I have to be honest, this is a little shallow, but it's my learning. You should be developing your own questions. So as I'm moving from that early base, late base, what I'm really starting to look at now, and I've shown this in a lot of webinars, FTP to VO2 max. I'm looking more from a metabolic sense. I'm really looking at FTP metabolically, but the relationship is part of the move on strategy. From a cardiovascular sense, I'm looking at VO2 max. I'm also watching my estimates of LT1. And I do generally in different aerobic formats, I'm looking at aerobic efficiency. It's one of the better generalized metrics. Measuring things, anything in heart rate is tough because there's a lot of variable there. But heart rate does give us some insight into strain. And if you don't look at it too precisely, too closely, it can give us excellent understanding of response trend. I look at cadence and power, and I actually look at fatigue resistance in this phase also. So the comment was, don't go to you need to go, but know when it's time to leave, right? Each phase needs to be that. And you should have your uh, hurdles. I always think about it as a group of toggle switches, right? And they're all, when I start training, they're all up. They're all in the off position. Up, base training, early base, toggle down. Up, now it's time to flick that toggle. Now we move on to the second toggle. I wait till it's right. Up, click that toggle down. Next one, click, that's what it should be. Don't go till you need to go, But that's where also don't be overly constrained by these 4-week clean little blocks of periodized training. It's fuzzy. So the good news as we move to mid versus early training, tracking becomes more clear. Focus starts to move away from LT1 movement to talk more about LT2, which is more easy to determine, easier to track. And yes, where we were looking at closing the gap between LT1 and FTP or LT2, I should have used the same exact terminology there. But now we start really thinking about pushing FTP up and closer to VO2 max. And what I mean by this is a plate spinner, meaning, maintaining all your different fitnesses is like that circus performer who spins 5 plates at a time, right? They run over here and they spin this plate and then they run over here. You're juggling a little more in this phase. That's the balance between volume and intensity. That's understanding all those things. You're managing a little more. And you need a hard and soft data approach. Opinions coming. So for me, the best measurements, I'm going to give you 3 best measurements and simple ways to track them. Your FTP, or your maximal lactate steady state. Man, I need to clean this up. I shouldn't cross over terms. LT2, FTP, or maximal lactate steady state. Let's lump them in as one thing. Is the best measurement of your metabolic fitness. Remember, multiple systems working together is the best measurement of your metabolic fitness. Not your only one, but the best because it's clean and it's simple, right? Your VO2 max is the best measurement of your cardiovascular system. Again, not the only one, but it's clean and it's simple. So at the core, and again, this is no new chart that I've not shown before. I use this chart at the core. I've got a couple of bells and whistles of mine. I got to be honest that I'm not sharing, but at the core, this is what I'm using. And all I'm looking at is orange is MFTP, red is their VO2 max relative. And here I'm looking at the percentage of power at VO2 max to power at threshold, which is the purple. And I can see over the 90 days, this athlete is improving to some degree. I can see that's ticking up, right? So back here on 11:15, their VO2 max to threshold was 82.2%. Now in this mid phase, I want to improve that. I want to build high metabolic fitness. I'm pushing threshold above through intensive aerobic training. Sitting here today, they're moving forward. They're at 83.2. And I'm going to keep pushing that till they're like 84. But I can tell you already, this athlete that metabolic gain is coming on quickly. It might be time to move on sooner, or maybe so quickly that I have to do a maintenance cycle. But you've got to adapt that periodized strategy. I'm tracking unique physiological metrics. Remember, the metrics will plateau before performance plateaus from part 1. Tracking those unique metrics. So I'm watching the gain. This is one of my core transitional activities. It's what I'm looking for. And when I go from early base to mid base, I'm really just looking at improvements in LT1. I want to move that onset of blood lactate off to the right. I don't really worry if that is driving new FTP or new VO2 max. It tend to move them up, don't get me wrong, but I'm not tracking that. Now in mid intensive aerobic, I am tracking the relationship between FTP and VO2 max. I want this improvement to get to around 84 to 85%. That might not be possible for every athlete. Go back through their history and find their high water marks and use their high water marks as part of your target. I'll get into this in part 3, so I'm only going to glaze over it. Glycolytic capacity is your best indicator, is a better indicator than VLA max as your power and speed production. Because in the end, power is the key, the metabolic driver of power. Capacity is more important than the single number. I'm only saying that now to say it's not totally ignored. I will look at that intensity in that phase, but that's really what I'm gearing towards late in this period. I'm looking much more at these metrics as I prepare for build and peak, which are very short windows for me if you remember my schedule. Great chart by Richard Rawlinson. This is really the right way to look at it. He's putting a line where VLA max is and adding it as a number down here. and he's also showing the capacity range. So this is real. I really like this chart. I'll get into this in part 3. I'm just telling you that it's part of the consideration. I just didn't want to skip it as a measurement and have people ask me, what about, because I look at this, I want this, honestly, I do want to see this moving a little as I go into that build peak. And sometimes I will add some additional intensity to mid and even early training if I see this relationship getting too low versus the athlete's own history. I hope that makes sense. I'm not using a set number or a profile. I'm using it against the athletes. So I'll add one higher intensity workout every 8 to 14 days. But if I see real decline here, like too much decline here, I'll maybe do a little more than that, because I don't want it to get so low. I don't want those things to drop. I don't want VLA max and glycolytic capacity to drop to a point where I've got to do a lot of work to get them up and rolling again in my peak or my build and peak phase, because I don't want to spend more than a total of 6 weeks, 8 weeks in build and peak. So if you let these drop too much in this mid-intensity phase, because that's the cost, do a lot of intensive aerobic work, spend a lot of time between LT1 and LT2. Remember my plate spinning point. This plate slows down and might fall off. Don't let it fall off. You still have to run over there every once in a while and spin it. All right, in closing, this is my last slide before Q&A, and I'll tackle and stay on as long as you guys want for questions. You also can't ignore the role of subjective data. I had slides showing there's really good subjective data dashboards of RP, feelings, HRV, even though that's not really subjective, you call it what you want, sleep, this and that, right? Metrics, all these things we have. Probably the thing, a place we can advance ourselves the most in coaching and knowing and understanding the fluidity of periodization, structure, but yet fluid, is you have to blend all of these hard metrics. I gave you some ideas, right? And if you go back and read my chart, you can see there's more. Read my little grid of what I use. I only showed you very select items. There's more in the grid. It always has to jive with the athlete's subjective data. If you teach your athlete to communicate, whether it's how they feel, RPE, sleep, even if they don't have a sleep device and they're just telling you, they're just scoring their own sleep, you would be surprised. Once the athlete, after a year or two of experience gets tuned into their feelings, if you're listening to them well and listening in a way that you're crunching some of those analytics, I should have posted it now that I think about it, the subjective data dashboards that we have, you'd be surprised how many times the athlete feelings are indicating that it's time to move on, maybe even before your own analytics do. The athletes do know. The more they train too, the more they actually do know it. So you need to be prepared. You need to use all that other subjective data. Don't ignore it. Don't be like, wow, my system says there might be more in her. There might be more in him. Listen to both and balance it. That's the art of coaching, which can be forgotten. All right, sorry that went a little long. I know it was 80 slides. There's nothing I could do to make it shorter. That's the best I got. I'm going to start tackling questions now. Anybody who does not want to listen to the questions can drop off, and I will begin to tackle them at this time. Question number 1, are you going to discuss an annual plan where you have 4 or 5 races in a year? How to merge one cycle A into another? I'll touch on that as a closing for my final webinar, but that really is a big struggle and it's complicated. The idea of periodization was written when there was one big event. You went to the Olympics, you went to the World Championship, and everything was about peaking for that one. As a matter of fact, it really was more about the Olympics. So we have to kind of cut up the theories as we have multiple peak events. But I will tell you something, if your athlete has 4 or 5 peak events, they will not peak at any of them. Or maybe just choose to peak. Yeah, if they have 4 or 5 A events and you try to train them to 4 to 5 A performances, they probably won't peak at any of them. They might be good, they might be pretty peaked, but they won't be absolute peak. An athlete can achieve maybe 1 to 2 absolute peaks a year. So a first answer to that is maybe reduce the way the athlete sees peak events and what's an A event, in which case, don't just adapt periodization to suit the athlete's desire to be on peak form for every event they have, because that's the new norm, isn't it? I want to be awesome for everything. Well, awesome for everything means you're just pretty good for everything. You want to be awesome, you got to one full A, one or two big A periods a year. Next question. Do you think a longer, I answered that one. Can heart rate drift in a sweet spot session be an indicator of enough and it's time to go on? Yeah, friends, I showed heart rate drift in part one. Watch my comments about that. It would be the same here. Same here. It is one of the subjective, I wouldn't call it subjective. It is one of the soft data points that I'm looking at day in, day out. And I gave you my chart. All right, John has a question. This question is regard of coaches, athletes who in 2020 COVID made a conscious decision along with their athletes to back away from much training at or above anaerobic threshold LP2 to prevent both mental and physiological fatigue and burnout. Has anyone found that in 2021 thus far, this type of athlete is able to tolerate increased ramp rate due to the super solid extensive aerobic base? John, great question. Post that in the Facebook. I bet you get some really good discussion. I'll give you my 2 cents on it. It's a 60% good, 50% bad. I know that's 110%. The 60% good is exactly what you're pointing out. I think people laid off intensity sort of for a year. They got a lot of mid-range intensity because they turned to Zwift and group rides and other motivations, but at least the high intensity kind of got buffed out. The bad side that I've seen is this is year I've seen more athletes come into the 2021 season with high CTL than I've ever seen before. Because they not only use that year to leverage a lot of training, they just keep training, right? It's like, heck, what else are we going to do? We don't have events, we don't have other stuff. So they're coming into seasons with CTL like 110 and 120. And I think one of the challenges for coaches in 2021, and I've seen this, and it's great to point out the challenge without a solution, right? But it is what it is how do you take an athlete coming in with a very high CTL, probably lifetime high CTL, through a new season, right? How do you add progression and overload? It's going to force a lot of us coaches to rethink that. It's a challenge. Great question for the Facebook group to see what others think. When you have a low VO2 max, but your MFTP is like 90% of your VO2 max. Yeah, Jordan, I saw your question in Facebook too. Dude, sometimes that's just it, right? So like if you're showing a chart like this, here's my answer, right? Everybody, we're all unique. So you could, for most of us study in a lab, we can achieve our threshold power is about 85% of our power at VO2 max. That's reasonably common. But that doesn't make it absolute, right? Everybody's unique. You need to go back and look at your historical points. Your history, the answer lies in your history, right? And that should be your target points of progression. What was your absolute peak? Like, what was your highest percentage point historically? Well, get to that point and maybe try to go a little further. And if a little further doesn't work, go, nah, that's my point, and move on. Now, the content of how you get there, that is where you might want to try things differently. That might let you think through different training variation, different intensity volume manipulation, right? That's where maybe a more unique approach. Maybe you need an undulating approach of periodization versus the linear. I'm a big fan of undulating periodization. I think it's underutilized, under talked about. And the only reason I don't talk about it more is because I'm a coach too. And I use it more. And I think there's a lot of power in undulation. So find your place. Do you want EF to be going up or down during intensive blocks? Over the course of a full block, I want to see the athlete become aerobically, I want to see them become more capable of generating higher power for longer aerobically. Now, those things are super related to each other, particularly the longer. And the reality is, I want more aerobic power. We all know aerobic power, the ability to burn fats, or fatty acid oxidation, ketosis, all the things that we want to start talking about. We know that that gives a much longer burn rate. Athlete can sustain power longer. It is a more efficient way to do it, right? So we do want to improve that until we don't, right? Until the cost of that is too high. So during all that training, yes, I want all the indicators of aerobic efficiency to be improving and aerobic capacity to be improving. This is for moving how to measure time for moving from SST to FTP. Yeah, I'll cover that in part 3, like when we start going to FTP. I'll pick up in the end of base into peak and into build and peak combination. When to look forward. And when I will generally move from SST to FTP, like this athlete here, I was like, maybe it's time to move on. That would trigger my evolution. If I start getting to like 84%, and that historically has been their high, I'll consider starting to do FTP. But the reason I hesitate to answer that question now without the full webinar is I might do a maintenance bit of time in there. I don't want to move to FTP too soon. The most important and rapid growth I want, right? The point where I want rapid returns from the athlete, and I'm willing to invest high training intensity and high accumulated fatigue, right? Is I want them in that, and sorry to be scrolling all the way back, but I want that rapid gain. All right, get there faster. I just know as soon as I go faster, I'll pass it. I want that rapid gain here in the build and peak. I want that rapid gain here. I want to do everything I can to not advance the athlete too slowly. Remember, this isn't 3-4 week periods. All of these can be adjusted. I have asterisks by all of them, which could be they're not time bound. The reality is I want to get the maximum out of this phase. I have the time. Sometimes you just run out of time. Maybe the athlete's still improving, but man, you're 7 weeks, 6 weeks out from your big race. You got to move on and get them peaked. Okay, you do that. But other times you might have 4 weeks, you might be ahead of schedule. So what do you do when you're ahead of schedule, right? And you start hitting those good physiological markers. Well, that's when it's time to just slow it down a little. Don't leave till you have to, and invest in some deepening of that response. But I'll go into that in part 3. Yeah, Jordan, volume might be your answer, even though that might not be a possible answer. Ruben, to what extent do you use extensive, intensive, optimized intervals during late phase? I use them a lot, right? You got to be tricky with extensive and intensive aerobic. And here's where it was a great question earlier. I forget who asked me, but I regret the overlap of names at the moment, but just compartmentalize. I'm talking about a theory here, but now I'm talking about the eye level. I showed images of 2 times 20, right? Or 3 times 15, whatever they were, but I use intensive aerobic optimized intervals as a guide way more. I probably could have showed how I've done that here, but just don't have the time. I do use it as a guide, but be careful because at this time of year, your curve could be a little flat and there could be more overlap between extensive and intensive. Just thinking about using the high end of one intensive and the low end of the other extensive might be the best answer. So if you use the high end of your intensive numbers here, works really well. Intensive aerobic targeting. But that being said, the bigger issue is don't break down the idea of the training rhythm you have, that pyramid approach. You might start adding too much intensity when you're chasing optimized intervals. So be careful there. I explained that way better in part 1. To clarify, moving on, once FTP and VO2 max is 84 to 85, do you believe the aerobic based training has gone as far? Good question, Eric. I could have done that clearer. So Eric's question is a really good question. Man, we just need days to do these. Guys, I strive so hard to make them short, it just doesn't work. Eric, what this is telling me, when this gets up to 84, 85, that's about as much room as the metabolic fitness as represented by FTP has to grow. I'm now bouncing against the ceiling. I'm bouncing against the ceiling, which is, that ceiling is my cardiovascular fitness. So once you're against that ceiling, you really have no room to go. You're going to keep banging. If you keep doing sweet spot, you're not going to increase anymore because it's the cardiovascular limitation that you're going to start punching up against. So you need to go and create some more room. You need to raise VO2 max. You actually, what I'll say first in part 3 is you want to raise VO2 max, actually driving this percentage right back down so that then you have room to grow underneath it. Hopefully that helps. And that's late base into build. Again, fuzzy. I always have a hard time putting them in exact little blocks. Changes when reverse periodization, when volume is constrained in base due to weather or lockdown. So Beth, I talked about reverse periodization in cycle 1. I'm not a big fan of reverse periodization, only because for most cyclists, it is physiologically what seems like a pretty good answer on paper, but from the specific demands of event performance, it's usually counterintuitive. Because think about, and this is my opinion, an athlete is doing all their intensity early, like 12, 20, 24 weeks out from their big events, their race season, right? And low volume. And then as they go through this season and get closer to their events, they're doing less intensity and more volume, therefore actually literally slowing everything down. Then they go into a race, which requires, intensity, right? And the specific prep they were doing in the 8 weeks leading in, where most of your performance ability comes from what you were doing in that 8 weeks, was high volume, lower intensity. So it's inverted. It doesn't work for those type of events. Now, I have a feeling you're talking about something like ultras and stuff like that. If you're doing ultras and whatever, then yes, you need to think about reversing this whole paradigm to some degree, and volume becomes the late driver, because you would want more volume late, which I would just call periodization. I wouldn't even call it reverse periodization, because the reality is the demands of the event is high volume. So you're getting your high volume late. The difference is there, I wouldn't get low volume if I was an ultra. I wouldn't start the season at low volume. I'd be getting as much volume as I could until I got about 8 weeks out. Then I try to get even more, because that's the demand of the event. Hope that helps. What do you think is the best way workout to higher the fat spot wattage? The idea of fat max and training right under LT1 and fasted training, there's plenty of information out there. It depends is going to be my answer. That's something, every coach can learn and help you walk through. There's plenty of information out there on that. Tim, when do you transition from SST to FTP work? It's typically late base. That's where I'll go next. We'll finish up base with a quick cycle of FTP and short. So here's the problem, right? Whenever we say FTP work, think about this, Joe, and think about this, everybody who's still listening and hasn't fallen asleep. If you talk FTP work, what do you usually go to? 4 times 10 minutes. And most people actually do those at supra threshold, just above it. So the reality is that will raise your VO2 max, clear room for threshold to grow, and then threshold grows. That's late phase base, early build. Again, it gets a little hard to explain, because it really, at this phase, you're really following the athlete's progression. When they get to a high percentage here, I move to FTP training, 4 times 10, maybe even 4 times 8, hard start, some other things that are a little in between. Remember you have to be varied. But what I'm really doing is this threshold, the way I'm increasing threshold is, yes, we're going harder, right? More harder, remember my athlete point. But we're doing super threshold, which is now raising the roof a little. It's increasing that VO2 max. If the athlete's going to be a race is under 90 minutes or something like that, 120 minutes, 60 minutes, I might do pure VO2 max right out of that phase. The point is, as you get further down the periodized chain, the more individualization and the more specificity matter. So it's hard to answer the question in general. So Jordan, and again, you guys feel free to drop off. I'll keep answering questions, but so you propose using a more polarized model, not necessarily absolute, later to polish rather than early in buildup to drive up VO2 max. Yeah, Jordan, I do propose that. I don't, unless there's a highly, let's say it's a newer athlete or somebody, and there's some really intensive reason to drive up VO2 max early. I don't polarize until we get to those build and peak phases. Then I'm very polarized because I want hard days really freaking hard, right? I want the athlete to go hard and do as much work. As a matter of fact, all of my base phase training, the three phases of base, right? Early, mid to late, and late. All of those bases are so that the athlete can go harder. Once we get into that build and peak, I execute that build and peak in a polarized fashion. So Joe says, I appreciate it. I will look forward to next webinar. I just recall from other webinars that when you hit 81 on MFTP to VO2 max, that's when it's thought you moved to FTP to close the last gap. Yeah, it might be. You know, again, Joe, that don't, and it's always hard, right? You're talking in a webinar and you got so many things in your head. Maybe I said 81 somewhere and that's fine. The key point is your history. Look at where your peaks have been. Like, what's been your greatest raise? Sorry if I made that confusing. Would reverse periodization be appropriate for ultras? Yep, Jordan answered that. You must have asked it while I was answering it. And thank you. And this is the last question. So Joe, if you're 84.5 and that historically is very high, get after it. Meaning evolve. You might be at a time frame based on when your A events are, or if you're just trying to create fitness, a linear growth of fitness, a semi-linear growth of fitness or performance, move on. Last question. Talking about VO2 max's ceiling to FTP, any thoughts to Pmax and FRC serving as a ceiling of VO2 max, and any trends to percentage based on this? Dave, that's the next session. We'll do 15 minutes on late base into build progression. And you're talking about exactly what we'll be doing, talking about. We're going to talk about the relationship of Pmax, FRC, VO2 max limitations, stuff like that. So we'll get into it in the next webinar. I will share this slide deck. I'll post this recording here very shortly. And in the description, in the notes below in YouTube is a link to this slide deck. You don't need to email me to get it. It's in the notes below. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming.